Hello, this is part 2 of our quantum metamechanics series. In this video, we're going to be discussing quantization. And so what is quantization? Because this is fundamental. What is a quantum? So quantum is the smallest recognizable unit of something. Quantization is the process of mapping continuous, infinite values into a smaller set of discrete, finite values. So it's by approximating real-world values using a representation that introduces limits on the precision and range of a value. So essentially, what you have to do is, people think that the fundamental unit of reality is a zero-dimensional cut, which just but if you have an infinite mass of zero-dimensional cuts, how many dimensions do you have? 0. And how much spatial extension do you have? 0, because there's no actual extent to the point. So you have to have something which is still has the same continuity of the regular manifold, but is able to account for spatial extension. So firstly, we need to recognize that reality is a metalinguistic meta-object. We've been over the apologetics for this in previous videos, but essentially, just take my word for it. It's an intrinsic language. We have the equation here. It's an intrinsic language which creates the reality it describes by factorizing through a conspansive semi-model and a linear ectomorphic semi-model. So both this potentialization and conspansive phase, whereby it's and the conspansive manifold is a metamathematical structure which actually describes the evolution and existence of reality as it evolves over time, which then there's this terminal representation, the surface structure of LO, or the objective language, versus the subjective language, which is the actual representation of that potentialization into a kind of linear sequence of events. But really, the fundamental nature of reality is language. It's existing according to this language, which is creating this the meaning and intelligibility of reality. It's relating, the fundamental things which are generating reality isn't actually the physical representation themselves, but these kind of ideas and forms and symbols which relate to one another in this non-terminal domain, the spirit world. And so it does this linguistically, because the purpose of reality is essentially self-identification. Reality is saying, I'm like that, in order to extend, reinforce, and define its structure. It has to take the linguistic structure of the things which it's representing in order to do that. So it's a metalinguistic meta-object. People will say, is reality a language, or is reality that which is described by that language, even if they accept that reality is a language? And the fact is that it's both. It's both a language and it's an object. And so it's a meta-language because it's creating the reality it describes, and it's a meta-object which describes the reality it creates. It's doing both of these. These are its two semi-models, which then combined you can fuse these two halves together and extract out the implications to find out that reality is actually an intrinsic language. An extrinsic language would be something external to reality describing reality, but because there's nothing external to reality, this is the fundamental principle of the CTMU, reality contains all and only that which is real, then you can't have something external to reality describing reality, because if so, if it were real enough to describe reality, it would be real itself. So reality has to describe itself, meaning it's a metalinguistics, it's describing itself using a meta-language, meta-object. It's being described, but through the representation of the meaning being communicated. And so if you have all these zero-dimensional cuts, that doesn't make any sense. So instead, because it can't achieve that, it doesn't have that deep linguistic structure, and it doesn't even have any capacity to have the spatial extension. So instead, the fundamental unit of reality in Chris Langen's CTMU is syntactic operators. It's still a particle. It's still in some ways zero-dimensional. It's still a point, but what it does is, according to if you can think of these as little pixels of reality, and pixels can display any state, basically. And so how do syntactic operators choose what to display? They can take on spatio-temporal extension through the cognitive perceptual syntax at 5 levels of utility, through the primary and secondary teller. So what is the intrinsic ends and purposes of reality? What is it striving towards? And then the syntactic operators can represent that linguistic meaning and and the primary syntactor, the secondary syntactor, and the tertiary syntactors, which is what is actually the rules and structures for what can be instantiated. And this is at three different levels. So the primary level is God's syntax. The secondary level is the human cognitive perceptual syntax. This is what determines the structure of our experience, which is then related to the inner structure of the universe, which is both a language and a mind for that reason, because that's how we actually relate to it. And the tertiary level of utility is the syntactic operators themselves, and they don't have any intrinsic utility, but they're able to transform the global syntax and then use those five different levels of structure in order to actually gain spatial extension, but then they decohere when they're not being looked at. So this is why we discussed Principle 6 of quantum mechanics in our last video is to be perceived, that the quantum wave function collapse in between observation, there's this potentialization whereby these syntactic operators, which really generalize to telesis, a latent informational medium of infocognitive potential, which can become anything in space and time, and then that coheres into a single possibility, into a single thing which is being actualized. So you have these two phases of quantum mechanics. The first is potentialization, and the second is actualization. And so reality, this is described succinctly. Reality doesn't waste CPU. It's not continuously generating things while you're looking at it. At least it's only doing so at the tertiary level. So there's some sort of coherence. If I stop looking at a wall, it doesn't totally go away. But the only reason the wall existed in the first place is according to the primary and secondary utility. It's because I want to be sheltered from the outside. I want to have a living environment, have a walled structure which keeps rooms and etc. organized. There are a lot of reasons why I might want a wall, but this actually goes back. The wall thing actually goes back. There's a theory that the reason human civilization even developed is because of walls. So this is actually really deep, and you can see this in the symbolic patterns of reality. In the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden is a walled garden. But that's a digression. So reality doesn't waste CPU. It's not continuously generating things while I'm not looking at it. It only has these kind of decoherent structures, but it retains this memory. It has this morphic resonance with itself such that it can relate to itself over time and continue its structure at these primary and secondary levels. And so this is why human beings are actually integral to the structure and evolution of reality, because there can't be spatial extension without this secondary level of utility. And so the metaformal system is how you describe all of reality. It's this intrinsic language which is factorizing through this conspansive manifold, which is you can consider the conspansive manifold is if you think of M, the metaformal system, which is reality, and it's also the language of reality, which is reality itself, because reality is a language. You can think of M as a car, and so the conspansive semi-model, which is where the deep structure of reality resides, is essentially, you can think of that as the frame of the car, the wheels, etc. What is actually pushing it forward, and from the static friction force, and how it interacts with the road, and then it can exist and evolve over time. You can think of that as the static friction force with the wheels. And so the conspansive manifold is a metamathematical structure which actually describes and parameterizes and generates how reality evolves and coheres over time according to these 5 different levels of utility. And then the linear ectomorphic semi-model is the actual representation of that. So you can think about that as the terrain being generated because while you're looking outside of the car, and then the intrinsic language, which is what is actually the M is the engine. It's what's actually pushing the car forward. It's this intrinsic language by which reality exists and evolves through this conspansive potentialization and actualization. And these two phases, potentialization and actualization, are actually two phases of a more fundamental process called conspansion. So this is what the quantum wave function collapse is doing. It's potentializing and then actualizing reality according to a utility. So that's the fundamental building blocks of reality. Then are sentient agents, are observer participants at the secondary level of utility. So this is why John Wheeler says we live in a one electron universe. He called up Richard Feynman, says, isn't it kind of weird that in the universe every single electron has the exact same weight? And Richard Feynman said, yeah, it is kind of weird. We've been trying to figure that out. And John Wheeler, because he's a really eclectic guy and had really interesting thoughts, he says, what if they're all the same electron? They're all part of this single body, this single quantum object, and the quantum object scales up to because it's the quantization of a fundamental identity, and that fundamental identity is an electron itself, meaning it itself is inter-expanding and requantizing at every moment in adjacent to these quantum fields, and our observation, which is creating the surface level of reality, is actually just this excitation of this deep reality, of this conspansive manifold. And so we're poking it, and it's generating a representation according to this intrinsic utility of the universe itself. So quanta must scale to telecoherence through this meta language, because M, the entire universe, is a self-simulation of M through of the metaformal system through an intrinsic language, such that because it's a language, and language needs a representation in order to make sense. So it's simulating itself through this conspansive semi-model and linear ectomorphic semi-model, such that it can exist and evolve over time, using tellers and syntactors in the non-terminal and terminal domains respectively as its alphabet, as its fundamental building blocks, and then evolving according to a generative grammar. It determines when I have this excitation of this deep reality, what is the structure which is actually coming out of that, and then I then have this surface level representation, these words, which are actually spatiotemporal relations or instantiations of information and cognition, which then organize the universe. And so the structure and evolution of reality is quantized at three levels: global, agentive, and subordinate. And it's a fractal language which mirrors the structure of heaven and earth at every level. So heaven is this non-terminal domain, this spirit world of potentialization, whereby various aggregate utilities are paired off against each other, and then earth so that's the spiritual meaning, which is informing the instantiation of reality, and then earth is the actual terminal representation of that. So it's a fractal language which mirrors the structure of heaven and earth, and is self-similar at every level. It's like a giant Romanesco broccoli. It's you can zoom in as far as you want, and you can zoom out, but you'll see the same structure. This is the what's it called? The correspondence principle coined by Niels Bohr, that quantum mechanics must scale. It has to, at large scales, reproduce classical physics. So reality is a special kind of language which creates the reality it describes, and reality must be a language, because in order to bridge the gulf between form and content, or between heaven and earth, or the non-terminal and terminal domains, or potentialization and actualization, must have this quantum wave function collapse, which coheres not only at the quantum level, but at the global level. We've talked about the CTMU is actually the logical implication of the one electron universe. Chris Langan has a YouTube short about this, if you want to check that out on CTMU Radio. The only way to bridge that gulf is through cognition, perception, identification, attribution, and information. All of these are quantized in the form of language. They're actually identifying and recognizing and attributing things about reality. This is true of cognition and perception as well, according to a base syntax, which is actually objectively modeling reality in the minds of observer participants. And so, where reality is quantized in terms of cognition and perception, which are languages, it must itself be a language. So there's this semantic connectivity that is demanded by the structure of how we relate to reality. and the fundamental imperative of reality is the creation of meaning, and that is necessarily linguistic. When we say something means something, we're saying that there's a linguistic relationship which distributes over the two. And so what's the linguistic relation which distributes over everything? What actually relates all the things in reality to one another and to the whole? And this has to be this same meta-language, this metaformal system, which describes and creates reality. And because the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. And this is what Tyler Goldstein, the author of Sentient Singularity Theory, says, is that it's this overflowing of reality because it can't just exist and evolve in its own structure. It has to go beyond that and create a spatiotemporal or infocognitive representation of what it's actually doing. And so M is an alphabet of N and T according to a grammar, MU, which then creates the surface structure of S sigma, which is the actual words. In order to generate S sigma, its surface structure, that which you can see, it uses the grammar mu, which is like a metalinguistic messenger pigeon, which communicates the state of M inwards to each of its points and the state of the points outward to M, such that the system as a whole can evolve according to 5 utility functions in the signature sigma. So sigma consists of 2 parts: the non-terminal domain and the terminal domain. And the non-terminal domain is quantized in terms of 2 utility functions. So the 2 in N, who are tellers in the non-terminal domain, meaning they are embodied spirits with teleology. So if you'll remember Jung's definition of teleology, it's the intrinsic striving towards a goal and a series of directed aims seeking to fulfill themselves. So actually, these source of identification operators actually have to have something called free will, which is they can freely will the structure of their response to objectively model reality, because they're not just passive acceptors, but they're also transducers. They're providing quantum information to reality such that it can exist and evolve, such that it can collapse the quantum wave function and, and conspan and go through these inner expansive and requantization phases according to the secondary utility of its tellers. So this is happening at both the primary level. The primary level is God, and happening at the secondary level of humans, because we're actually providing, this is the participatory universe of John Wheeler, that we're actually providing the quantum information by which the universe's early days, by which the universe itself is created it's created such that we can provide the maximum amount of information, because this is, if you think about, if you're a metaverse, what kind of universe would you want to instantiate? And what kind of universe you want to instantiate is one that is most friendly to secondary tellers, that can actually communicate and instantiate and express the most possible meaning through the semantic connectivity of observer participants, which then, so physics gives rise to observer participancy gives rise to information, and information gives rise to physics. So you want a closed loop which can create the reality it describes in the shortest amount of time by expressing and communicating this fundamental meaning. So the primary teller is God, who is the creator, and thus affect causal pathways. And so the primary teller is God, who is obviously the creator and king of all existence and is identified with the whole of M. So all of these different utility functions are embedded within the primary teller. And the secondary tellers are human beings for whom reality is simulated. So why is reality the way it is? This is the anthropic principle, you can either the strong anthropic principle of classical physics or John Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle, is that reality is the way that it is because for the purpose of the evolution and existence of biological life, of consciousness, such that it can recognize and attribute structure to itself. So the secondary utility of God, and these 2 classes of beings comprise the non-terminal domain or spirit world. So this is the patterns which are potentializing reality and every secondary teller, every observer participant which will ever exist across time, and God himself, the structure in which all of this can exist and evolve, the creator and king of all existence. And these two telic identification operators are the non-terminal domain, which is the deep structure of reality. So this is why Chris Langan says that human beings aren't just supervening phenomena on brute physical processes. They are, in a sense, the processes themselves, because these processes are just the terminal representation of their intrinsic will. It's a will and representation. It's fundamentally an idealist framework, because it's this cognitive perceptual syntax at two levels, at the level of God and at the level of humans actualizing a particular world, which has certain laws and structure which is conducive to its own evolution. And this comprises the non-terminal domain N, which is which is the most important part of the alphabet of sigma, the fundamental building blocks of reality, the letters which instantiate the meaning. The alphabet is these you can then have in this non-terminal domain or spirit world. It can then compare various potentii and test them against one another, and then one is selected as a telon, which is an intention which guides cosmic and biological evolution according to the primary and secondary utility of its tellers. So then there are three telic identification functions occurring in T in the terminal domain who are syntactors. The primary is God, the secondary are humans, and the tertiary are particles and syntactic operators themselves, which have no teleology of their own, but can be configured according to the utility functions in the non-terminal domain, and they determine the syntax, and the rules and structure of how potentii are actualized. So the instantiation of objects and relations thereof are transformations of the primary syntax at the secondary and tertiary level. So this is how reality exists and evolves, is through these three levels of syntax and these two levels of teleology. So that is how reality is quantized. The fundamental building block of reality isn't just random objects bumping into one another. It's not a mechanistic materialist framework. It's actually generative at through these five telic identification functions, and that is the fundamental building block of reality. You don't want to go as small as possible. It's not you're just partitioning reality into smaller and smaller substances. You have to say what is actually the fundamental building block of how reality relates to itself, and this has to be through God, and God is identified with the whole thereof. So how does God relate to himself? And this is through human beings, through the instantiation of meaning and spatiotemporal relationships, and the self-organization and self-design and emergence of all of these, and in order such that it can distinguish between self and non-self. Reality is creating an identity. So this is the fundamental quantization of realities. I'll spell it out. Reality is creating an identity through three levels of utility to distinguish between self and non-self, and define, reinforce, and extend its structure by the global level, identifying with the true and good order created at the agentive and subordinate levels of utility. That's how quantum mechanics scales to higher order coherence. These five utility functions / identity operators interlock to form the conspansive manifold, a metamathematical structure which describes and creates the evolution and existence of the real universe, as well as its alternating potentialization and actualization. If you zoom out far enough, you'll find that this very structure described in the language of quantum mechanics actually applies to general relativity as well. So where the conspansive manifold is fractal-like, the inner expansive / requantization quantum wave function dynamic actually happens at all scales. It's almost like the universe is breathing. And if it didn't have this continuous evolution, it would suffocate in its own rigidity and its conformance to its structure. And so it's evolving at essentially the speed of light, and the speed of light is the speed of information, and information is how space and spatiotemporal relationships are organized. And so it doesn't want to go too fast and doesn't want to go too slow. So it sets this constant for itself, such that such that it will eventually generate this complexity, this true and good order, using these syntactic operators which can instantiate and express and communicate meaning to itself and to one another. It can relate to all the other syntactic operators and then relate to the entire primary syntactor, the actual syntax of reality itself, which is determined by God. The orderly harmony of all of existence is created at the primary level as well as the secondary and tertiary levels. And so without this requantization, it would suffocate in its own rigidity. So this is how quantum mechanics passes the correspondence principle, so that we can actually scale such that the principles which apply to quantum mechanics, if we scale up and zoom out, these will actually reproduce classical physics and eventually general relativity as we get to the existence and evolution of the universe itself. And then we can start to get to quantum gravity. So this is what we'll try to get into in this series. So thank you. Let the light shine forth from the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.